Okay, so we're going to go a little deeper into the darkness. What is the darkness in the context of the soul? In the previous video, I talked about this, gave you a little metaphor and some things like that, and I'm going to go a little bit deeper into that. So hang in there with me, and I'll get started with just a quick recap of the vision that I was given many years ago. And that vision was of a swan in the ocean. And then that ocean became covered in this black tar of oil. And that oil then covered the swan, and the swan slowly began to drown. But you see, the swan was a metaphor for the soul. And the soul cannot drown, it is eternal, it will live forever. And so let's dig into this darkness, this oil, and the oil spill of the ocean in context to this swan, it's being the darkness. And so in this metaphor, in this vision of the soul being overcome by darkness, the message that I received was that the oil is darkness and it is sin. And let me explain sin, because as I learned, it was to miss the mark. And that really, the context in which I was taught that and how it was probably interpreted by the people who made that remark thousands of years ago, their perceptions were different than mine. And so it's never just really sat that well with me and how it was taught to me when I was a very young person. And so for me, I had a revelation of what is this darkness of that is suffocating my soul and the soul of each human. Each human is the swan in this metaphor and pulling that darkness, the cloak of darkness over themselves. And so in that moment, the revelation was sin is ignorance. Ignorance. So what is the soul? What is the person ignoring, right? And it's the ignorance of the true self. It's the ignorance of the soul. So anytime we get into ignoring truth, eternal truth, our truth, that helps perpetuate the suffocation of darkness for the soul. And again, so that darkness is unconsciousness. It is that which doesn't know itself in this context. And it manifests in a lot of different ways. Some people call this shadow work these days. And if you're not familiar with that, it's essentially just reactive behavior that might manifest out of nowhere, or if you get in certain relationship patterns and you start reacting a certain way, or you feel like you're reverting back into a previous pattern and you don't know why. That's kind of shadow work. Is just really addressing the cause of that and the resolution of that. And so that would be part of not ignoring what the soul is and what it is asking to be seen. And so again, darkness is needed. It's needed in context of the plane that we live on, in this relative world, because the light, the soul, comes into this world, into this body, and it is wrapped in a cloak of darkness. And it calls upon this cloak of darkness intentionally, because in order for the soul to know itself as light and love, it has to have the opposite to exist. Otherwise, there's no relationship. If you could imagine yourself in just an entirely white universe, there's no form, there's no shapes, there's no boundaries, it's just white forever. And it would feel like eternity, and we would all probably go insane. You could do the same thing with any color, really, but there's no relationship there. There's only one value, and so there's no contrast to experience the difference of what that is. So this darkness is here on purpose, and it is misunderstood, because the darkness is really a champion of the soul. It's here for the soul to experience itself. The darkness around us as human beings is here for us to experience ourselves as light and love if we so choose. So there will always be darkness. Always. Fear and darkness will always exist. The degree in which they exist or are present is a relative degree. It's relative to the individual and it's relative to the collective. And the less the individual ignores of the soul, the less darkness there will be. The less the collective, as in the human collective consciousness, ignores the darkness or recognizes it, then it will have less of it. Another way to say that is, the more you pay attention to your soul, the less darkness around you there will be. Or to put that another way, the less the darkness is around will impact your state of being. So there's this relationship here between the dark and the light. And we will never, ever, ever defeat darkness. In fact, you can't defeat darkness and you can't resist darkness. It's kind of this, it's a little bit of a paradox that we have to experience within ourselves, because we're like, oh, but there's all this evil and all these bad things are happening. I agree. And they're manifestations of ignorance, of ignoring soul, right? On an individual level and on a collective level. If we moved into not ignoring and paying attention to and being present with what we create and the things around us, then the illusion of that darkness disappears and we get to see it for what it is, and the illusion of its power goes away over the individual consciousness and over the collective consciousness. So you can't defeat the darkness. And the reason for that is because the darkness requires you to believe in it. The darkness requires you to feed it. If you don't feed the darkness, it won't grow. It'll be there, but once you start feeding it, and I'll get into that, once you start feeding it, it starts growing. And not only that, it actually kind of starts taking over your consciousness. Because we're feeding it and it gets fed, and it's like a parasite. It's a symbiotic relationship, and it gets the better end of the stick, basically, when we feed it. And so basically in this context, the darkness is that which is unconscious, that which is unlooked at, that which is unintegrated within the self, right? That which is fragmented. So all the different parts and pieces of us are out here, and we deny them and we judge them and we place them outside of ourselves instead of being a totality of the soul. That's what keeps everything fragmented and keeps us from experiencing separation, the illusion of separation. And this is where we get into suffering and anguish and all of these things that are not desirable for anybody I've ever ran across. So let's get into talking about, like, how do we feed this darkness? In the previous video, I talked about how as a child we start to identify with the voice in our head. Then we start to identify with the narration of that, the story of that voice. And then that goes on to the collective and so on and so forth. But what happens as soon as we start to identify with those things, we start feeding that parasite of darkness, and it starts growing, and it starts embodying the physical vessel, because it gets wired up into our physical makeup, if you will, and how we act and respond in our personality and all that kind of good stuff. So it creates neural pathways in our body. And we continue to identify with that most of our life. If we don't go through this process, we're just going to think we're our story. We're going to think we're our profession. How many people have you asked, who are you? And they say a job title. That is definitely, you are not your job title. You are not any label you can put on yourself. And so that is the darkness, is the identifying with the wrong structures. The structures will always be there. Darkness will always be there. But the question has always been, who am I in relationship to the darkness? There's been so many enlightened human beings who have come to this planet, and they teach one meditation, that's who am I? And there's variations of this, but it's who am I and don't know. The first time I met a Zen master, it was in Kansas, Lawrence, Kansas. We went to the Zen temple there. Probably in the early 2000s, there was a Zen master there, to my surprise. I had no idea. And he taught this meditation. It was one of the first meditations I learned in Zen, is who am I, don't know, in relationship to the breath. It's that simple. And some people, some of these masters, that's all they teach is who am I? And that's it. Because we're getting to the truth of not ignoring the real being behind all of the identities. We cannot defeat the darkness. They will always be there. So to know thyself, thy true self, to know thyself as the soul that is disidentified with these structures, is to know thyself. It is to have that revelation and understanding of enlightenment. There's been a lot of different definitions of enlightenment, but the simplest way is that I've heard it expressed is that if you can say I am, you're enlightened, and everybody's enlightened. And that's where all the confusion begins, and people spend a long time with this particular thing of becoming enlightened because they're identified with maybe their physical structure, their sexuality, their gender, their family structure, their religious structure, their institutional structure, career, so on and so forth. It just and then the nationalism, all the things. This is who I am, and that's not the truth. So it is, who are you? I am, and then any experiences that arise out of this I am, because there are experiences, that's what we're here for, they're just experience. So instead of saying I am my thoughts or I am feeling this way, there are thoughts. There are feelings. There is sadness. There is grief. There is happiness. There is joy. I am, and there is these things. And that's what helps us to become in this world and not of this world. Because then we can consciously choose where we place our attention, even at a greater, let's say, a greater impact or with greater veracity, without being kind of pulled off center of who am I is. And that's not to say that, there's nothing inherently wrong with any of these things that we have set up for ourselves in these identity structures. They're quite functional most of the time, and sometimes they're not, and that's quite apparent when they're not, because there's a lot of ignoring going on, and that's when a lot of the pain and the suffering happen. And then we get into greed and jealousy and all these other kind of things when we're misidentified with the true self and the ignorance. And this is a lot of these older religions, they kind of talk about overcoming the same human tropes of, like I said, greed. It's so hard to gluttony, jealousy, the 7 deadly sins. Basically, most of them all have their own thing, and that's because of how we identify with ourselves. So know that the darkness is here. It doesn't have to have power over you. Once you look at it for what it is, then we can start to have this relationship where we can have identity and we can tell stories and be part of a story, but we're not attached to those things. We're just playing in those things. So there's a real space for freedom when we start to look at darkness in this way. And we'll go back again. That's when we start to identify with that voice, that narrator in the head, and that narrator starts telling a story because of all the pain and pleasure that it receives, and it starts to build continuity, and it starts to fit into structures of family and society and all this kind of stuff. And then all of a sudden, this is me, and that's not me. That's the darkness that's just taken my life and ran with it, because I didn't know as a child what I set myself up for, because as a child I'm that soul that came into this world and pulled that blanket of darkness over myself so I can experience myself moving backwards into childhood, if you will, back into the purity of the soul, or the magnificence of the soul, and still be in relationship with the darkness. So when we go on and we set out to resist and to fight and to defeat the darkness, you're actually feeding more of that system. If you look at the world, not much has changed in forever, because most of the people on this planet, most of the cultures, most of the collective consciousness doesn't understand this, because they think that, oh, the light's gotta win, cool, great, and then the cycle starts all over again. Or the dark's gotta win, and nobody thinks they're a good guy or a bad guy, right? But like, we clearly have tyrannical forces, we have forces for freedom, and those two just kind of loop around over and over, and not a whole lot changes until we have the awareness not to perpetuate those systems. And that's why I'm spreading this, I'm giving this to you in hopes that you'll get a glimpse and understanding of how you work on the inside of you, so you can taste that freedom of not disidentifying or being so caught up in or attached to the identities who aren't you. So, dug in a little bit deeper there. There's more we can go into, but I really want to stick to a personal level here with this. So, we can't defeat the darkness. The darkness is unconsciousness. Once we start feeding into wrong identity, we start feeding the darkness. Drama feeds darkness. The more we participate in drama, we feed darkness. When we start participating in peace and we start participating in paying attention to the true self, it starts to go away. It's as in the power of it starts to subside, and the world and the activities around us look a lot different. So we can't defeat it, and it's there to help us experience ourselves as that love and light instead of the fear. But it has to be there in order for us to experience that. And there can be this harmony with all of this, because once we start getting into that space of truly identifying who we are, peace naturally flows from that space. And when peace naturally flows from ourselves, that affects everything around us. That's a topic for another discussion, but essentially it's the law of attraction. And so I will leave you with that. I hope you got a lot out of this. If you need to, again, make a playlist, come back to this one. It's really important, and I hope you enjoyed.